Welcome to Dark Untold, the place where shadows linger and forgotten voices whisper through the night. Here, we bring you the most chilling true horror stories from deep within the Appalachian Mountains and beyond. Stories of haunted cabins, cursed hollows, and restless spirits that refuse to be silenced. If you dare to step into the darkness with us, prepare yourself, because what you're about to hear is not just legend. It's Dark Untold. The first thing I noticed about Pine Hollow was the silence. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the weight of quiet pressing down as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Locals had warned me, not in the half-joking tone they usually used when talking about ghost stories, but with a seriousness that unsettled me. If you hear the knock, one old man told me at the gas station before I set out, don't answer, don't even move. Just pray it stops. My name is Mark Latham. I'm 34, a freelance journalist based in Lexington, Kentucky, specializing in local history and folklore. My editor had sent me to Breathitt County to write a piece about forgotten Appalachian legends, the kind of stories that linger in oral tradition long after they've disappeared from books. The tale of Pine Hollow came up again and again, a place where settlers once vanished, cabins left empty with food still on the table, doors shut tight but covered in fist-sized dents. The story always ended the same way, an endless knock that drove people mad. I reached Pine Hollow on a damp October afternoon. The air smelled of wet leaves and distant wood smoke, and the clouds hung so low they seemed to scrape the tops of the ridges. My car could only take me so far before the road turned into little more than a deer path, so I walked the last half mile with my backpack heavy on my shoulders. The forest closed around me, maple and oak crowding the narrow trail, their branches knitting overhead until the light dimmed like twilight, though it was only 4 in the afternoon. The hollow itself opened suddenly, a small clearing ringed by trees. At its center stood a crumbling log cabin, its roof sagging, the chimney long collapsed. Grass grew high around the porch, but the door stood closed, solid, as though waiting. My pulse quickened at the sight. I took out my recorder, describing the scene, noting the stillness, the faint metallic tang in the air that reminded me of old iron. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and ash. The floor groaned under my boots, and cobwebs brushed my face as I pushed deeper into the single-room space. A stone hearth yawned black and cold at the far wall, and in the center of the room, a table sat as though frozen in time, a rusted fork still resting on its edge. The windows had no glass, just empty frames staring out at the tree line. I set my gear down, unrolled my sleeping bag, and made notes by the fading light. By the time night fell, a heavy fog had crept into the hollow, swallowing the edges of the clearing. The temperature dropped fast, and the air felt damp and clammy against my skin. I lit a lantern and sat by the table, jotting down what I'd gathered about the legend. Some said the knocking began with the Shawnee, that Pine Hollow was cursed after a massacre. Others claimed a prospector had gone mad here, killing his family before sealing himself inside the cabin and pounding on the walls until his hands broke. The most common version said that once you heard the knock, it never stopped, not until you answered it, and by then it was too late. It began just after 10. At first, it was so faint, I thought it was my imagination. A single rap at the far wall, dull and hollow, like knuckles against wood. I froze, pen suspended over paper. Another knock followed, louder from the opposite side of the cabin. My breath caught. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, testing the logs. But then the knocking came again, 3 times, evenly spaced, on the door. I held my lantern high, the light trembling across the boards. The door didn't move, the latch remained shut. Yet the knocks came again, steady, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me not to get closer. I whispered into my recorder, "The knocking has started. It sounds human." The knocks shifted then, circling the cabin. The wall by my shoulder, the far window, the roof above my head. Each one sharp, controlled, as though someone walked the perimeter, testing every inch of the cabin with patient hands. I pressed my back to the center post, lantern clutched to my chest, heart pounding so hard I thought it might drown the sound out. But the knocking only grew louder, insistent, until it filled the hollow with a rhythm I felt in my bones. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. My ears strained, waiting, every nerve on edge. I had just begun to breathe again when the knocking exploded directly behind me on the inside wall. I jumped, slamming into the table, the lantern rattling. I spun, light flaring across empty boards. Nothing there. No hand, no figure, just the deep impression of 3 fist-sized dents appearing fresh in the wood. I nearly bolted then. My rational mind screamed that I had enough for my article. More than enough, that no story was worth this. But my legs wouldn't carry me. I stood frozen, shaking, as the knocking resumed slower now, almost taunting, echoing from the door. I don't know how long I sat there, rocking in silence, trying to will myself not to listen. But the knocks never stopped. Sometimes they came soft, like fingertips brushing the wood. Other times they boomed like hammer blows, rattling the cabin so hard dust sifted from the rafters. And worst of all, sometimes they came from directly beside me, though nothing ever appeared. At some point, I must have dozed, exhaustion dragging me under despite the noise. When I woke, the lantern had burned out, and the cabin was black as pitch. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick, and the knocking was still going steady, endless, as though it had never ceased. Only now it was accompanied by something else. A voice. It was low at first, barely a murmur threading between the knocks. Then it grew clearer, broken words pressed through the boards. "Open. Please. Open." My blood ran cold. The voice was neither entirely male nor female, neither young nor old. It was something raw, jagged, as if dozens of voices overlapped into one. I clapped my hands over my ears, rocking, whispering to myself that it wasn't real. But the knocks grew louder, the voice more desperate, until it seemed the cabin shook with the force in it. I thought the door would splinter, the walls collapse. My sanity cracked then. I grabbed my recorder and shouted into it. "It won't stop. It won't stop knocking." That was when I heard its faint footsteps inside the cabin, crossing the floor behind me. I spun, but the darkness was absolute. The smell hit me then, a stench of damp earth and rot, as though a grave had been split open inside the room. The footsteps circled, slow, deliberate, matching the rhythm of the knocks on the walls. My throat closed with terror. I fumbled for my pack, for the flashlight, but before I could find it, something brushed my shoulder. Cold, heavy, human. I bolted. My body finally obeyed, slamming through the door, stumbling into the clearing. The fog clung thick as wool, muffling my screams. The knocking didn't stop. It followed me into the night, echoing from every tree, every stone, as though the whole hollow itself had become a drum. I ran blind down the trail, branches whipping my face, lungs burning, until at last I saw the faint gleam of my car. I drove without stopping, tires spitting gravel, hands shaking so hard I could barely keep hold of the wheel. Even after I hit the highway, even after Pine Hollow lay miles behind me, I could still hear it faintly. A soft, steady rhythm, like knuckles rapping against the inside of my skull. That was 3 nights ago. I haven't slept since. Wherever I go, the knocking follows. At my apartment, in my car, even in the dead of night when I press a pillow over my ears, always 3 knocks. Always patient. Always waiting. This morning, when I opened my notebook, I found 3 fresh dents pressed into the cover. I don't know what happens if I answer. I don't want to know, but I'm starting to fear that sooner or later, the knocking won't wait for me to open the door. It will just come in. The first thing I was told when I asked about the hanging tree cabin was simple. Don't stay there after dark. If you hear the rope creak, it's already too late. I should have taken that advice seriously. My name is Daniel Hughes. I'm 31 years old, a freelance writer from Charleston, West Virginia, specializing in Appalachian folklore. Most of my work has been small articles for local history magazines, blog posts about legends passed down through generations. But I've always wanted something bigger, a story with teeth, something that would chill readers long after they put it down. That's what brought me into the hills of Fayette County one October evening, chasing whispers about an abandoned hunting cabin and the tree that loomed beside it. The cabin was said to have belonged to a Confederate deserter named Silas Crane, who was caught and hanged during the Civil War. According to local lore, the tree beside the cabin was where they strung him up, but Silas didn't hang alone. The story went that deserters, drifters, and even accused witches were dragged to that same tree, their bodies left swaying in the mountain wind until the branches groaned. They called it the hanging tree, and anyone foolish enough to stay in the cabin beside it would hear those ropes at night, taut and twisting, even when nothing was there. I reached the cabin just before sunset. The road had turned to gravel long before, and then to dirt, my old Jeep rattling over ruts and roots until I thought the undercarriage would snap. I parked at a clearing, the last pale strip of daylight spilling across the ridge. The cabin squatted at the edge of the woods, a sagging skeleton of logs and rotted shingles. Its single chimney leaned at an angle, blackened by time, and the windows gaped like eyeless sockets. Beside it stood the tree. It was massive, older than the cabin itself, its limbs twisted and thick, stretching wide like a skeletal hand clutching at the sky. Its bark was rough and dark, gouged in places where ropes had bitten deep. Even from a distance, I swore I could see grooves where bodies might have swum. A chill seeped into me, sharper than the evening air. The first thing that hit me as I approached was the smell. Damp wood, wet leaves, and something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. The silence was unnatural. No birdsong, no wind, just the faint crackle of fallen leaves beneath my boots. I told myself this was what I came for. Atmosphere, texture, the kind of details readers craved. Still, my fingers trembled as I set up my recorder, muttering into the mic about the site's history, the fading light, the looming sense of dread. Inside, the cabin was worse. The floor sagged under my weight, boards warped and soft. Cobwebs stretched across the corners, thick as gauze, and the air was close and sour, like wet ash. A rusted iron stove crouched in one corner, its pipe split open, and a broken rocking chair lay on its side near the fireplace. What unsettled me most was the graffiti scratched into the walls. Not the usual teenager scrawls, but crude words. Home, turn back, still here. I set my sleeping bag on the least rotted patch of floor and sat with my back against the wall, taking notes by flashlight. The rational part of me knew this was just an old ruin, nothing more. But as the last of the daylight slipped away, the cabin seemed to breathe around me. The walls creaked, the tree outside groaned, and the silence pressed against my eardrums until I thought I'd go mad. It started around 9. I had just finished eating a granola bar when I heard it, the faint sound of rope tightening. A slow, heavy creak, as though something were swaying just beyond the walls. I froze, my pen poised above my notebook. The sound came again, louder this time, a steady rhythm, wood and hemp grinding against each other. My throat tightened. I switched off my flashlight and sat in the dark, straining to listen. The creak shifted, moving from one side of the cabin to the other, as though whatever hung from that tree had begun to swing in the night air. But there was no wind. Not a single leaf stirred outside. The smell changed then, stronger, a sour, rotting odor that pushed bile up the back of my throat. My skin prickled with cold sweat. I forced myself to the window, wiping away grime with my sleeve. The tree stood tall in the moonlight, its branches black against the sky. And there, God help me, I saw shapes hanging from its limbs. Not one, but several, swaying slowly, though the night was still. My breath hitched so hard, the glass fogged beneath my nose. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, looked again. Nothing. The branches were bare. I staggered back from the window, heart pounding. The floor creaked beneath my boots, but it wasn't just the floor. It was all around me now. Rope tightening, wood groaning. I could swear I heard the faint snap of a neck breaking over and over like echoes in a cavern. That was when the whispering began. At first, it was so soft, I thought it was the blood rushing in my ears. But the longer I stood in the dark, the clearer it became. Low, guttural voices, overlapping, as if a dozen throats were murmuring through rope-choked mouths. My name slipped among them. Daniel? Drawn out, strangled, almost sung. My knees buckled. I clutched my recorder with shaking hands, muttering into it, voices, multiple. Can't make out words. But even as I spoke, I realized I didn't need to make out the words. I could feel them, heavy as a rope tightening around my throat, urging me closer to the door, closer to the tree. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe some part of me thought I'd prove it is the wind, a trick of nerves and shadows. But the instant the door creaked open, the night hit me like a wall. The smell of decay, the cold air thick and suffocating. The tree loomed taller, its branches stretching wide, the grooves in its bark glaring white in the moonlight. And then I saw him. A man hanging from the lowest branch. His clothes were ragged, his face bloated and dark, eyes bulging, lips cracked and twisted into a grotesque grin. The rope bit deep into his neck, swaying though the air was still. His eyes locked onto mine. They moved. They followed me. I stumbled back, slamming the door, my body shaking uncontrollably. My chest heaved as I pressed against the wall, flashlight trembling in my hand. When I finally dared to look again, the window was filled with faces. Dozens of them, pale and swollen, pressed against the glass from the outside. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering my name, while the ropes around their necks jerked and twisted as if tightening all over again. I screamed, fumbling for my things, but my recorder had fallen from my lap, the red light still blinking. And above everything, the whispers, the pounding of my own blood, the groaning of ropes. I heard it. The floorboards above me creaked. There was no upstairs. Something was moving across the ceiling, dragging ropes that groaned and tightened. Dust sifted down onto my hair, and the air turned so heavy I could barely breathe. I bolted from the cabin, crashing through the door, sprinting into the clearing with my flashlight swinging wildly. The tree loomed overhead, its branches crawling with bodies, swaying though the night was dead still. Some were men, some women, some children, their faces bruised and swollen, eyes following me no matter where I ran. I stumbled to my Jeep, hands shaking so badly I could barely jam the key into the ignition. The engine roared, tires spinning in the dirt as I tore down the rutted road, branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, my chest burning, eyes blurred with tears. Even then, the sound clung to me. Rope creaking, wood groaning, voices whispering my name through strangled throats. That was 3 nights ago. I'm back in Charleston now, but I can't escape it. At night, I hear the rope tightening in my apartment. I wake with red marks around my neck, as if something is trying to pull me out of bed. Last night, I found dirt on the floor by my window, as though boots had tracked in from the forest. The hanging tree cabin is miles away, but I don't think I ever really left. When I close my eyes, I see those faces in the glass, waiting. And sometimes, when the silence is thickest, I hear the whisper again, strangled and low, curling around my ear like a noose. Daniel. They told me if I ever heard whistling at night out by the old farmhouse on Copperhead Ridge, I should turn around and leave immediately. Don't whistle back, the locals warned. Don't even look for the sound. That's how it follows you home. I should have listened. My name is Andrew Collins, 36 years old, a history teacher from Columbus. In my spare time, I chase old ghost stories across the Appalachian spine of Ohio, partly for research, partly for that gnawing curiosity that keeps me awake at night. It was the first week of November, the air brittle with cold, the sky smeared with gray like wet ash. I had driven 3 hours into the foothills to interview some locals about a place they called the Whistling, farmhouse a ruin of rotting wood and broken windows perched on a forgotten stretch of road, half swallowed by forest. The legend went back nearly a century. A family, the McCullochs, had lived there during the Depression. They raised hogs, grew corn, survived on almost nothing. But neighbors began to talk about the strange habit of the father, a man named Elias. They said he whistled every night as he walked the property, low and tuneless, the kind of sound that made the hair on your arms prickle. Some said it was just a nervous tick. Others whispered that Elias was calling something. When the family vanished one winter without a trace, the farmhouse left empty. The whistling never stopped. People swore you could still hear it if you stood by the broken fence after sundown. I arrived just before dusk, my notebook and recorder stuffed into my jacket pocket, my breath turning white in the fading light. The farmhouse looked worse than I expected. Its roof sagged inward, shingles missing like teeth, windows black with grime. A smell of mold and wet earth hung heavy around it, mingling with the faint coppery tongue of rust from the old barbed wire fencing. I should have felt alone, but the silence pressed in like a weight. Not a bird, not a cricket, not even the distant hum of cars. Just the creak of the farmhouse settling into itself, as though it were alive and breathing. I told myself I'd just take a few photos, jot down some impressions, maybe poke around inside before nightfall. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I climbed to the porch, flakes of paint peeling beneath my gloves. I tried the front door. It swung open with a groan that set my teeth on edge. The smell inside hit me hard. Mildew, dust, something acrid like burnt hair. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on warped floorboards, sagging wallpaper, a broken chair lying on its side. The house seemed to lean around me, as if it knew I was there and was listening. I wandered through the rooms, each one worse than the last floor's bowed, plaster hanging in strips, doorways crooked and rotting. I found the kitchen first. Rusted pots still hung from hooks above the stove, a table tilted on one leg, a child's spoon lying in the corner as if dropped in a hurry. The smell was stronger here, metallic and sour, like old blood. My pen shook slightly as I wrote in my notebook. Family vanished 1934? House untouched? Feels staged. Then, faintly, I heard it. A whistle. Low, steady, tuneless. Coming from outside. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip. For a moment, I thought it was just the wind squeezing through cracks in the boards. But no, the pattern was too deliberate, like someone pacing the yard and blowing air through their teeth. My stomach twisted as I crept to the nearest window, brushing away grime with my sleeve. The yard was empty. Dead corn stalks sagged in the field beyond, and the woods crouched at the horizon, dark and thick. But the whistle didn't stop. It circled. I spun, the sound shifting from one side of the house to another, as if someone were walking just out of sight, dragging that sound with them. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to slam the door and drive until the farmhouse was just another ghost in the rearview mirror. But something rooted me there, a mix of fear and fascination, the same reckless compulsion that had driven me into abandoned churches and graveyards before. I whispered into my recorder, my voice unsteady. November 3rd, approximately 6:30 p.m., inside the McCulloch farmhouse. I'm hearing whistling. It's circling the house. My breath caught as the whistle stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I turned back toward the kitchen and saw it. In the cracked glass of the window pane, my reflection was there, but it wasn't alone. Behind me, faint and pale, stood a figure. Too tall, shoulders crooked, its head bent forward at an unnatural angle. My chest seized. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through dust. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. But when I looked back at the glass, the figure was still there. And this time, its lips were pursed. The whistle started again, but now it came from inside the house. Panic hit me like a wave. I stumbled back through the hallway, boards groaning under my boots. The whistling followed, growing sharper, closer. My own breath came ragged, echoing in the dark. I reached the front door and yanked it open, spilling out onto the porch, desperate for fresh air. The night had fallen fully now, the sky black and starless, and the field stretched out like an ocean of shadow. That's when I realized the whistling wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was above me. I tilted my head, heart hammering. On the sagging roofline, perched like a broken weather vane, was a figure. Its limbs were wrung too long, too thin, its silhouette jerking in unnatural angles, as if it had forgotten how to be human. The whistle seeped from its crooked mouth, shrill and hollow, echoing across the empty fields. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I bolted. The grass ripped at my jeans as I tore across the yard, lungs burning, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The whistle didn't fade. It chased me, weaving through the trees, sliding into my ears, no matter which direction I turned. I swear I felt breath on the back of my neck, a cold hiss pushing the sound deeper into my skull. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking so violently, I dropped my keys twice before jamming them into the ignition. The headlights cut through the dirt road, and still I heard it, the whistle threading through the engine's roar, clinging to the air around me. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, parked outside the single diner where I'd first heard the story. I sat there, hands clamped to the wheel, chest heaving, waiting for silence. It never came. Even now, back home in Columbus, I can hear it. At night, when the house is still, when the streets outside are empty, the whistle seeps through the walls. Sometimes it's faint, drifting through the vents. Other times, it's right outside my window, sharp enough to rattle the glass. And once, God help me, I woke to find myself whistling in my sleep, the same low, tuneless melody I heard on Copperhead Ridge. The farmhouse is miles away, but the sound followed me. Maybe that's what they meant when they warned me. You don't go looking for the whistle. You don't follow it. Because once you hear it, it never leaves. I don't know how long I can live like this, with the sound eating into every moment of silence. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the window and swear its lips are pursed, just a fraction of a second before mine. Sometimes I see movement in the dark corner of the room, too tall, too thin. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can feel the breath of something standing just behind me, teaching me how to whistle back. They warned me not to go looking for the mirror room. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, one old ranger told me at a diner off Skyline Drive, his eyes never leaving the black coffee in front of him. I laughed it off then, thinking it was another Appalachian ghost story, just one more tale to add to my growing collection. But there was something in the way his voice cracked, like he wasn't just telling me a story, but confessing something he'd seen and regretted ever since. I should have listened. I should have let the legend remain just that, a legend. My name is Daniel Mercer, 34 years old, freelance travel writer and amateur folklorist. I've spent years wandering the forgotten corners of the Blue Ridge, gathering tales that survive only in whispers, phantom trains, ghostly brides, lantern lights that lead hikers to their deaths. But the mirror room was different. Unlike most legends, everyone told it the same way. A hidden chamber deep in the mountains, its walls lined with mirrors from floor to ceiling, where no reflection ever matched the person standing in front of it. Some said the room showed your future. Others swore it showed the thing you feared most. A few insisted the mirrors didn't show you at all, but something watching from the other side. It was late October, and Shenandoah had just started its slow transformation into fire. Maples burning red, oaks fading to rust, the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. I rented a cabin near Big Meadows to work on an article, but the locals kept feeding me pieces of the legend. A man who vanished near Hawksbill Gap, last seen carrying an antique hand mirror. A woman who stumbled out of the woods near Thornton Hollow, babbling that her reflection had spoken to her. And always, always, the warning. If you find the mirror room, don't look too long. I didn't go looking at first. I told myself I was just enjoying the trails, just taking notes for the article. But every step deeper into the forest felt guided. The birds fell silent too often. The air grew colder in strange pockets, and more than once I caught a flash of light through the trees, like sunlight striking glass where no glass should be. I kept hearing my own voice in my head. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, but curiosity has a way of rotting into obsession. 3 days in, just before dusk, I found it. The trail I was following narrowed until it wasn't a trail at all, just a thin strip of earth pressed between trees. The wind had died completely, and the forest smelled of damp stone. That's when I saw it half buried in ivy, a door standing alone in the earth, like someone had built it into the hillside. It was old, weathered oak banded with iron. No cabin around it, just a door and nothing else. My chest tightened, but my hands moved before my brain caught up, brushing aside leaves and tugging the rusted handle. With a groan like a wounded animal, the door swung inward, exhaling a breath of air so cold it burned my lungs. The room inside was smaller than I expected, barely the size of a living room, and every wall, from floor to ceiling, was covered in mirrors. Some were tall and gilded, others cracked and framed in wood, others no more than shards nailed into the plaster. My flashlight beam bounced from glass to glass, multiplying into 100 fractured spots of light. At first, it was just me, a reflection staring back 100 times over. But then I noticed something wrong. In one mirror, my reflection didn't raise its hand when I did. In another, its face lingered a second too long after I turned my head. In a third, my eyes were black, pupil swallowing iris, like twin holes punched in glass. My throat went dry. I whispered into my recorder, my voice shaking, October 29th. Inside what locals call the mirror room. Reflections behaving. Unnaturally, saying the words out loud made them real. The longer I stood there, the more wrong things became. Some mirrors didn't show me at all, just the empty room, though I was standing in the center. Others showed me as a child, or an old man, or someone gaunt and hollow-eyed, bones pressing against skin. My stomach twisted as I realized one reflection wasn't me at all, but a woman I'd never seen, her face pale and expressionless, her long hair hanging wet as though she'd just risen from a river. She stood where I stood, mimicking every movement a beat too late. I backed toward the door, pulse pounding. But when I reached it, the doorway in the mirror still showed me standing in the center of the room. The woman's reflection smiled. I spun around. The real room was empty. That's when the whispers started. Faint, overlapping, like voices trapped behind glass. I pressed my ear to one of the cracked mirrors, and the sound grew clearer. Dozens of voices, layered over each other, all saying the same thing in a breathless chant. Stay. My skin crawled, my breath coming fast and shallow. My reflection stared back at me, lips moving in time with the voices, though mine were clamped shut. I tried to run. The door slammed before I reached it, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I yanked the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My flashlight flickered, and for a heartbeat, every reflection in the room turned its head toward me at once, even the ones that weren't me. My vision blurred, my ears filled with a high-pitched ringing. And then the woman's reflection lifted her hand and pressed it against the glass. My own hand moved against my will, rising to meet hers. The moment my palm touched the mirror, the cold nearly split me in two. It felt like plunging into ice water, needles stabbing every nerve. The glass rippled like liquid, and I swear I felt fingers press back from the other side. Her lips moved again, but this time no whisper came. Just a smile that widened too far, teeth sharp and endless, a grin that belonged to something that had never been human. I tore myself away, skin burning, and hurled my flashlight at the glass. The mirror cracked, spiderwebbing across the surface, and for a split second, the voices turned to screams high, jagged, furious. I bolted for the door, and this time it gave way, flinging me out into the night air. I didn't stop running until the forest opened back onto the trail. When I looked back, the hillside was solid earth again. No door, no ivy, no sign the room had ever existed. My hands were bleeding, the skin raw where it had touched the glass. And worst of all, when I turned on my recorder, the tape was nothing but whispers. Hundreds of voices, none of them mine, all saying the same word, over and over in perfect unison. Stay. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't escape it. Every mirror in my cabin feels wrong. I avoid them now, but sometimes I catch glimpses I can't explain, my reflection turning a half-second too slow, or smiling when I don't. Once, shaving in the bathroom, I swear I saw the woman behind me, her long wet hair brushing my shoulder. When I spun around, the room was empty, but the mirror fogged over as though someone had just breathed against it. I don't know what the mirror room was. A curse, a trap, a thin place where something from the other side can bleed through. All I know is that I found it, and now it knows me. They told me not to go looking. They told me not to open the door. And now, every night, when I close my eyes, I dream of a room lined with mirrors, and the sound of 100 voices whispering in the dark, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, when I wake, my reflection is still asleep. I was told never to go near the Screaming Shack after dark. People in the small town of Boone, North Carolina, said the woods up on Howard's Knob held something older than the town itself, something that wore voices like masks. They said if you went close enough, you'd hear screaming from the shack in the clearing, a scream that didn't sound quite human, didn't sound quite animal either. Some said it was the spirit of a woman who'd been murdered there 100 years ago. Others claimed it was the mountain itself, mourning all the blood spilled on its slopes. The one rule that everyone agreed on was simple. If you heard the scream, don't go inside. Walk away and never look back. I told myself it was just a story to keep kids from breaking into old cabins, but deep down, I think I wanted to test the rule. That was my first mistake. My name is Eric Dalton, 31 years old, a high school history teacher who moonlights as an amateur folklorist. I've spent the past 2 years documenting Appalachian legends, cryptids, ghost lights, haunted hollers. I'd covered the Brown Mountain Lights and the Devil's Tramping Ground, but when I kept hearing whispers about the Screaming Shack, I knew I had to see it for myself. I wasn't some thrill-seeking teenager. I wanted to record it, document it, make it part of the book I'd been working on. So one Friday night in late October, With the leaves burning orange and red around the mountains, I packed my camera, voice recorder, and flashlight and headed up the dirt trail toward the shack. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and the trail narrowed until the branches brushed my shoulders on either side. I remember how still it felt, no crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves, just my boots crunching on the gravel. It was unnerving, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves thickened the air, and my flashlight beam picked out the faint outline of the clearing ahead. I'd expected to hear owls, or maybe the distant hum of the town below, but there was nothing. It was like the world ended at the tree line. The shack came into view suddenly, squatting in the middle of the clearing like something the forest had tried to swallow but couldn't. The roof sagged, the walls leaned inward, and the wood looked dark, soaked with decades of rain and rot. A broken chimney jutted from one side, and what little glass remained in the windows was warped and cloudy. I took a deep breath and spoke into my recorder, my voice steadier than I felt. October 22nd, 10:17 p.m. Approaching the shack locals call the screaming shack. Reports of inhuman screaming sounds coming from within. No confirmation yet. Will proceed to document. Saying it aloud helped, but my stomach still nodded with unease. At first, I thought the stories were overblown. The shack was just an abandoned hunting cabin, no different from the dozens I'd seen across the Appalachians. I walked around it, snapping pictures, brushing cobwebs off the warped siding, noting the signs of age. And then, as I came to the front steps, I froze. The air shifted. A low, almost imperceptible hum rose from the ground itself, vibrating in my bones. My flashlight flickered. And then, from deep inside the shack, I heard it scream. It started low, like a groan, then built into something sharp and piercing, tearing through the silence and splitting the night wide open. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical thing, rattling the windows, vibrating the boards beneath my feet. It sounded like a woman and an animal at the same time, layered and twisted, filled with rage and agony. My stomach dropped, my mouth went dry, and every hair on my body stood on end. The rule came back to me immediately. If you hear the scream, don't go inside. Walk away. Don't look back. But I didn't move. I told myself it could be the wind rushing through some warped beams, or maybe a wild animal caught in the walls. I told myself that if I turned back now, I'd never forgive myself for not seeing the truth. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight, echoing too loud in the silence. The screaming had stopped, but the air felt charged, alive, as if waiting for me to cross the threshold. The door hung half open, and I pushed it with my boot. The smell hit me instantly: mold, mildew, and something metallic, sharp, almost like blood. My flashlight beam cut through dust swirling in the air. Inside, the shack was stripped bare, except for a broken table and a rusted bed frame in the corner. The floorboards sagged, stained dark in places I didn't want to imagine. I swallowed hard and raised my recorder. Entering structure. No signs of wildlife. Heard distinct screaming moments ago. Source unknown. The second I finished speaking, the scream started again, this time from just above me. My heart leapt to my throat. I aimed my flashlight upward. The rafters were exposed, black with rot. Nothing was there. But the scream didn't stop it, circled the room, bouncing from wall to wall, louder, sharper, and possibly close. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't in the air anymore. It was inside my skull. My knees buckled, and for a moment, I thought my head would split apart. Then, just as suddenly, it ceased. The silence that followed was worse. I staggered backward, gasping for air, when I noticed something carved into the far wall. I moved closer, flashlight trembling in my hand. The wood was gouged with words. rough but legible. "Don't listen. IT lives in the scream." My chest tightened. Whoever had written it must have heard what I just did. My brain screamed at me to leave, to get out before it started again, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the message, trying to understand what it meant. That's when I heard another sound, a whisper. Faint, broken, like someone calling from far away. "Help me." The voice was small, fragile, like a child's. My throat tightened. "Hello? Who's there?" I croaked, sweeping my light across the cabin. The voice came again, closer now. "Please, help me." It sounded like it came from under the floor. Against every shred of reason, I crouched and pressed my ear to the boards. The wood was cold, damp, and the voice was clearer. "He won't let me go." My stomach lurched. I scrambled back, eyes darting across the cabin. There was no trapdoor, no cellar door, nothing that suggested anyone could be under there. But the voice grew louder, more desperate, weaving with the memory of the scream until I couldn't tell one from the other. The air grew thick, my vision swam, and I realized with bone-deep certainty that the shack wasn't just a building. It was alive, feeding off sound, twisting it into something monstrous. I stumbled for the door, panic clawing at my chest. The porch was just steps away when the scream erupted again, louder than ever, blasting through the shack and pinning me where I stood. My flashlight exploded in my hand, plunging me into darkness. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, the sound shredding through me like knives. In the pitch black, I felt something brush my arm-cold, skeletal fingers curling just enough to let me know they were real. My scream joined the others, swallowed by the shack. And then silence. Utter, suffocating silence. I was on the porch again, gasping, the night air sharp in my lungs. I don't remember moving. The shack loomed behind me, quiet and still, as though nothing had happened. My recorder lay on the ground at my feet, its red light blinking. I grabbed it, shaking, and stumbled down the trail, not daring to look back. The woods felt different now, thicker, darker, the path twisting in ways I didn't recognize. Every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me. Somehow, an eternity later, I made it to my car. I drove all the way back to town in silence, headlights cutting through the dark, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. When I finally worked up the courage to play back the recorder, I expected to hear my own panicked narration, maybe the faint sound of my boots. Instead, all I heard was screaming. Not just one scream, but dozens layered together. Men, women, children, all shrieking in unison, deafening and endless. And underneath it, faint but undeniable, was my own voice begging, "Help me." "He won't let me go." I don't remember ever saying those words. It's been weeks since that night, but I can still hear it sometimes faintly when I'm alone in my house. A low, distant scream that grows louder if I try to ignore it. I don't know if it's in my head or if the shack has followed me home. I just know one thing. The stories were true. The screaming shack doesn't just echo sound. It steals it, twists it, and keeps it forever. And one day, I think my scream will join the chorus inside, waiting for the next fool who ignores the rule and steps across that porch. I was warned about Coal Hollow long before I ever set foot there. People in Charleston whispered about it, the way you'd talk about an old wound quietly, as if saying it too loud would make it bleed again. They said if you walked that road at night, deep in the Appalachian dark, you might see a single lantern bobbing through the trees, swaying in the distance as though carried by invisible hands. Some called it the ghost of a miner searching for his way home. Others swore it was a warning to turn back. No one could ever agree on what it wanted, but everyone agreed on one thing. If you followed it, you didn't come back the same. I thought it was just an old story meant to keep kids from sneaking into the woods. That was before I saw the light for myself. My name is Daniel Foster, 34 years old, a freelance journalist who's made a habit of digging into local legends. I grew up in Beckley, not far from the coal seams that gutted mountains and towns alike, and maybe that's why the Coal Hollow story pulled at me harder than the others. I'd written about abandoned shafts, disasters, and the men who spent their lives underground. But this legend felt different, too alive, too persistent. People still whispered about it in diners and gas stations. So one October evening in 2021, with my recorder, camera, and notebook packed in my bag, I drove out toward the hollow, determined to spend the night and see what truth I could find. Coal Hollow wasn't marked on most modern maps, but the locals gave me directions. An old road off Route 16, cracked asphalt that quickly gave way to gravel, then dirt, then nothing but two ruts carved into the forest. My headlights caught trees crowding close, their branches like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The air smelled faintly metallic, the way it does before a storm, though the radio promised clear skies. I parked by the remains of a wooden signpost, the letters long faded, and stepped out into the night. The silence struck me first. No crickets, no wind, just the weight of the woods pressing in. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I set up my small camp just off the road, a folding chair, lantern, and my camera mounted on a tripod. The earth was damp beneath my boots, and the smell of wet leaves clung to everything. I spoke into my recorder, narrating details like I always do, trying to anchor myself in routine. October 16th, 9:42 p.m. Coal Hollow, Fayette County. Locals report sightings of mysterious lantern light believed to be a ghostly apparition of miners lost in collapse, possibly tied to the 1920 Coal Hollow explosion. Saying it out loud steadied me, even though the trees seemed to lean closer every time I blinked. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed it. A faint glow between the trees, so weak I thought it might be my eyes playing tricks. It wasn't a flashlight or a car. It flickered too unevenly, too softly, like an old oil flame. The light bobbed once, twice, then steadied, hovering at the edge of the clearing. My breath hitched. I told myself it could be a hunter, someone carrying a lantern. But who hunts with a lantern in the middle of the night? My skin prickled with unease, and yet my legs carried me forward, crunching leaves underfoot. As I stepped closer, the smell hit me, coal dust and something acrid like burned oil. It was the smell of the mines, a scent I hadn't encountered since childhood when my father took me near the old shafts. The glow retreated deeper into the trees, almost playful, as if daring me to follow. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, and trailed after it. Branches scratched my jacket, the ground sloped, and roots snagged my boots, but I couldn't look away. The light pulled me forward like a hook in my chest. The deeper I went, the colder the air grew. My breath fogged in the beam of my flashlight, though the night had been warm just moments earlier. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded swallowed, muffled by the trees. No answer. The lantern bobbed again, closer this time, and I swear I saw a shadow behind it tall, hunched, carrying it as though cradling something fragile. But when I raised my flashlight, there was nothing, just the glow itself, hanging in the dark. My stomach knotted with dread. Legends about Coal Hollow came back to me, stories I'd half ignored in my research. They said the explosion in 1920 had trapped a dozen men. Their bodies never recovered. Some miners swore they heard knocking from the earth for days afterward, as if the dead were begging to be dug out. Others claimed the company sealed the shaft to cover up negligence, burying the men alive. Wives would come with lanterns, waiting by the mouth of the mine, hoping to see their husbands stumble out. They never did. Maybe this was one of those lights, still waiting, still searching. The forest thinned, and I stumbled into a clearing. My flashlight beam caught the collapsed mouth of a mine, rusted rails, rotting beams, rocks piled in jagged heaps. The lantern glow hovered just above it, swaying gently. I froze. The smell of coal was overwhelming now, mixed with the sour stench of something long dead. My knees trembled, and my hand shook so badly the flashlight beam jittered across the ruins. This can't be real," I whispered into the night. But the lantern flared brighter, and I heard it, a faint, hollow knocking, echoing up from beneath the rocks. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood rooted, listening. The knocks came in patterns, 3 slow, 2 quick, 3 slow again. A signal, maybe. My chest tightened as a cold realization crept over me. They weren't random. Someone, something, was still knocking after more than a century. My recorder in my pocket buzzed faintly, as though static had bled into it. Then the ground beneath me trembled, just enough to send pebbles skittering down the collapsed shaft. I staggered back, heart hammering, when a voice whispered my name. Not shouted, not called, whispered. "Daniel." My skin crawled. No one here knew me. The lantern dipped lower, almost touching the rubble, then rose again, turning toward the trees. It wanted me to follow. Against every shred of reason, I did. My flashlight flickered, the batteries draining far too fast, and the forest seemed to twist around me. The path I thought I'd taken vanished, replaced by brambles and thorn. The lantern led me deeper, and each step carried the weight of a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Somewhere behind me, branches snapped as though something else moved in the dark, not following me, hurting me. The glow ahead quickened, and I stumbled, gasping, until the trees parted to reveal an old cabin I hadn't seen on any map. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, but the lantern hovered at its door. The smell here was unbearable, like damp earth mixed with charred wood. I hesitated, bile rising in my throat, but the door creaked open on its own, groaning like a voice too old to speak. Against all logic, I stepped inside. The cabin was bare, except for a table and rusted tools scattered across the floor. Dust coated everything, yet the air felt disturbed, as if something had just passed through. The lantern floated to the center of the room, then extinguished, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight sputtered, then died completely. I was left with nothing but the sound of my own breathing, and then, faintly, another. Slow, labored breaths inches from my ear. I spun, swinging my dead flashlight like a club, but the room was empty. My chest heaved. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Silence answered. The air grew heavier, pressing on my lungs. And then I heard it again, the knocking, this time against the cabin's walls, surrounding me. 3 slow, 2 quick, 3 slow, over and over. My heart stuttered. I remembered the miners, the trapped men knocking in vain. Only now, it wasn't underground. It was here, all around me. The boards creaked under invisible weight, dust fell from the rafters, and the air thickened with coal dust I couldn't see, but could taste, bitter on my tongue. My vision swam, spots of light dancing, and I stumbled back through the door, gasping for air. The forest outside was different now. The trees loomed taller, thicker, the path gone entirely. My car, my camp, my chair vanished. Only the dark and the cold and the endless woods remained. And then, far in the distance, the lantern flared again. My knees nearly buckled. It hadn't ended. It was leading me deeper still. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I knew, if I followed it again, I wouldn't return. But as I stood there trembling, another whisper slithered through the dark, closer than before. "Daniel, help us." I don't remember running, only the sound of branches tearing at me, my lungs burning, and the unshakable certainty that the light was behind me, following no matter how fast I went. Somehow, hours later, I stumbled out onto asphalt, my car still parked by the faded signpost. My watch read 4:13 a.m., though I couldn't remember more than fragments of the night. My recorder was cracked, its tape filled only with static and faint knocking. The camera lens was shattered. My clothes reeked of coal dust. I drove back to Charleston in silence, too afraid to look in the rearview mirror in case the light was still there. It's been 2 years since that night, and I haven't gone back. I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear it again. 3 slow knocks, 2 quick, 3 slow. And when I close my eyes, I see the lantern swaying gently in the dark, waiting for me to follow. They say the Smoky Mountains keep their secrets. People wander in and never come out. Cabins collapse into the earth as if swallowed whole, and voices carry through the valleys long after the speakers are gone. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm 29 years old, a park ranger stationed out of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and I thought I'd heard every ghost story this place had to offer. But in the fall of 2018, while patrolling a remote section of trail, I came across something that still wakes me in the middle of the night. The story of the vanishing family isn't just a legend. I saw the proof with my own eyes. It started with a call from headquarters about a missing hiker report. A couple had phoned in after stumbling across what they thought was an abandoned homestead deep in the woods. They said the place looked lived in, smoke rising from the chimney, but when they got closer, it was silent and empty. That alone wasn't unusual. The mountains are dotted with the ruins of old cabins from before the park was established. But the couple insisted they heard voices, a man and woman talking and a child laughing, right up until the moment they stepped onto the porch. Then everything went silent. I hiked out early the next morning, the October fog still draped low over the ridges, the air damp and heavy with the smell of wet leaves. My boots sank into the soft earth as I followed the coordinates. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest grew, as if the birds themselves avoided that stretch of woods. After an hour of steady hiking, I saw it. A cabin half hidden in a hollow, its roof sagging but not yet collapsed, smoke trailing faintly from a stone chimney. My stomach tightened. The place didn't look abandoned. Curtains hung in the windows, faded but intact. A child's toy, a wooden horse missing a wheel, sat in the dirt by the door. I called out, identifying myself as a ranger, but no one answered. As I climbed the porch steps, they creaked under my weight, loud in the unnatural silence. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me: wood smoke, old cooking, and something else, something sour, like damp cloth shut away too long. Inside, the cabin looked frozen in time. A table was set with tin plates and cups, dust layering the surfaces, but not thick enough to suggest decades of abandonment. An oil lamp sat in the center, the wick blackened from recent use. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. This wasn't like the other cabins I'd seen, rotting and gutted. This one looked like its family had just stepped out for a moment. I took out my notepad, jotting down details, when a sound made me freeze. From the back room came the distinct patter of small feet, quick and light across the floorboards. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight. "Hello?" My voice sounded small in the stale air. I edged toward the doorway and pushed it open. The room beyond was empty, just a narrow bed with a quilt folded neatly across it. No footprints in the dust, no child. But I knew what I'd heard. I should have left then, reported the cabin, and brought a team back. But something about the place held me, like invisible hands pressing me deeper inside. I wandered from room to room, my flashlight beam cutting through shadows that seemed thicker than they should have been. In the corner of what must have been the parents' room, I saw a rocking chair move, just slightly, as though someone had just risen from it. The wood groaned and then stopped. That night, I stayed in my ranger cabin at the edge of the park, but I couldn't sleep. The images replayed in my mind: the smoke, the the toy horse, the sound of running feet. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound outside my window. Laughter soft, high-pitched, unmistakably a child's laugh. I bolted upright, heart racing. Through the glass, I saw nothing but trees swaying in the dark. I didn't sleep again until dawn. The next day, against my better judgment, I returned. The trail felt heavier this time, the fog clinging like wet wool around my shoulders. When I reached the hollow, the cabin was gone. Not collapsed, not burned, gone. In its place was only an overgrown clearing littered with mossy stones where a foundation might have been. No smoke, no curtains, no toy horse. I stood there for nearly an hour, walking circles, convinced I'd taken a wrong turn. But my GPS told me I was in the exact same spot. When I got back to headquarters, I asked around carefully, not wanting to sound like I'd lost my mind. One of the older rangers, a man named Carter, leaned back in his chair when I mentioned it. "You found the Walker place," he said. "Or maybe it found you." He told me the story like it was local gospel. In the late 1930s, before the park was fully established, the Walker family refused to leave their land. Most folks moved when the government bought up the properties, but not them. They stayed in their cabin, living off what little they could farm. Then one winter, a neighbor hiked out to check on them and found the place deserted. Tables set, beds made, fire still smoldering, but no sign of the Walkers. Not then, not ever. Search parties combed the area, but it was like the mountain had swallowed them whole. Since then, hikers sometimes claim to see the cabin, even hear the family inside, only for it to vanish when approached. I wanted to believe Carter was just messing with me, but the look in his eyes was too serious. He leaned forward and said, "If you hear the child laugh again, don't follow it. Folks who do, well, they don't come back." For weeks afterward, I avoided that part of the park, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Sometimes, while on patrol, I'd catch movement at the edge of my vision, like figures slipping between the trees. Once, while clearing a campsite, I found a wooden horse in the dirt, its wheel broken, identical to the one I'd seen on that porch. My hands shook as I picked it up, and the air around me turned icy cold, though the sun was high. I left the toy where it lay. The worst night came in December. I was alone in my ranger cabin, the wind howling through the trees, when I woke to the sound of knocking. 3 slow knocks at the door, steady and patient. I sat frozen in my bed, my breath visible in the sudden chill. The knocking came again, followed by a man's voice, muffled through the wood. "We're cold. Let us in." A woman's voice joined, soft and pleading. Then, faintly, the sound of a child laughing. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child hiding from monsters, my body trembling until dawn broke. When I finally dared to open the door, the porch was empty, but in the dirt were 3 sets of footprints. A man's boots, a woman's bare feet, and the tiny impressions of a child. I've never gone back to that hollow. I don't need to. The Walkers know I saw them once, and that's enough. Some nights, when the fog settles low and the forest grows quiet, I still hear faint laughter on the wind. And every time I do, I remind myself of Carter's warning. If you hear the child, don't follow. Because in the Smoky Mountains, some families never really leave. They're just waiting for someone new to join them. I was warned about the cabin long before I ever set eyes on it. Folks in Harlan County said there was a place up in the hills where no miner dared to sleep, a shack left behind after the mine shut down in the 70s. They called it the Phantom Miner's Cabin, and the rule was simple. If you heard knocking from inside, don't answer, and if you smelled smoke when the fireplace was cold, get out fast. My name is Michael Green. I'm 35 years old, a geologist working freelance contracts across Kentucky, and in the fall of 2020, I broke that rule. I didn't mean to. I thought I was just renting a cheap, quiet cabin in the hills to cut down on commuting. But what I found inside those rotting boards nearly broke me. The first time I saw it, I thought the place was just old, not haunted. It was a one-room shack tucked at the edge of a hollow, sagging under the weight of decades of rain and snow. Rusting tools leaned against the porch railing, their edges eaten away like teeth rotting in a skull. The air smelled faintly of damp coal dust and mildew, the kind of scent that never really washes away in these hills. Inside, the floorboards creaked beneath my boots, and the faintest scent of smoke hung in the air, even though the fireplace was black with ash. I told myself it was just residue from years past, but a shiver still crawled up my spine. I had been hired to survey abandoned mines for safety concerns, mapping shafts, measuring gas levels, logging cave-ins. It was tedious, but paid well. My job meant long hours in the field, often returning after dark. The cabin was supposed to be nothing more than a place to crash, but I could never shake the feeling that someone else had claimed it before me. Every night, after the crickets fell silent, the woods would go unnervingly still, and that's when I'd hear it. 3 sharp knocks against the wall, like knuckles on wood. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe branches swaying in the wind, or some animal scratching against the siding. But when I stepped outside with my flashlight, the trees were motionless and the ground silent. And the knocks weren't random. They came in sets of 3, always from the same wall, always just after midnight. One night, I woke to the unmistakable smell of smoke. My throat felt raw, as though I'd been breathing it for hours. I stumbled from my cot and saw the fireplace glowing faintly red, even though I hadn't lit a fire in days. The air shimmered with heat, and for a moment I thought the whole shack was going to go up in flames. But when I rushed to throw open the door, cold air rushed in, and the glow vanished as though it had never been there. The ash was cold, untouched. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely close the door again. By the end of the second week, I started hearing something else low, heavy footsteps pacing outside the cabin at night. Gravel crunching, boots dragging, moving slowly from one side of the cabin to the other. I would freeze in my cot, heart hammering, listening as the steps stopped just outside the door. Then, always, the 3 knocks would come again. This time they sounded deliberate, almost mocking. I asked around town, careful not to sound superstitious. The older miners didn't laugh. One man at the gas station told me a story in a hushed voice. Back in the 70s, before the company pulled out, there had been a cave-in in one of the shafts. A miner named Thomas Avery had been trapped inside. They dug for 3 days before they got to him, but by then it was too late. When they finally opened the shaft, they said he was still standing, pickaxe in hand, his lungs full of coal dust. After that, the cabin he'd been staying in my cabin was abandoned. Miners said his spirit wandered back to it at night, knocking on the walls, waiting for someone to answer. I laughed it off while he told me, but when I drove back up the winding road to the cabin, dread pressed heavy on my chest. I couldn't deny the knocks anymore. They were too consistent, too human. That night, I swore I wouldn't fall asleep. I kept my lantern burning low and sat at the small wooden table, my notebook open, listening. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ticking of my watch. Then, just after midnight, it came. 3 knocks, loud and sharp, vibrating through the boards. My breath caught. Against every warning, every instinct, I whispered, "Who's there?" The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Metal scraped against metal, deliberate and slow, like someone testing the lock. My lantern flickered. The temperature dropped so fast that my breath smoked in the air. I staggered back, my legs trembling. The knob stopped turning, but from just beyond the door, a voice rasped through the wood. "Let me in." It was rough, gravelly, choked with dust, like a voice dragged up from deep underground. I shook my head, too terrified to speak. The voice came again, louder, angrier. "Let me in." I don't remember falling asleep, but somehow the night ended. When sunlight finally poured through the cracks in the boards, the door stood shut, the knob still. But on the wood, just below it, were streaks of black soot where no fire had burned. The next day, I went into the mines as usual, trying to drown my fear in work. But when I was deep underground, with only my headlamp cutting the dark, I heard it again, knocking. 3 sharp raps echoing through the rock. My chest tightened. I told myself it was just loose stone, the natural settling of earth. But the rhythm was the same, too precise. Then, faintly, I heard breathing behind me. I spun, my lamp beam slicing the dark, but the tunnel was empty. Still, I felt the unmistakable presence of someone standing just beyond the light. I finished my survey in record time, hands trembling as I logged the data. When I emerged from the shaft, the late afternoon sun felt like salvation. But I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin anymore. Something wanted me there, and if I stayed another night, I wasn't sure I'd survive. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, stuffing notebooks and instruments into the trunk of my car. The cabin seemed to groan as I left, the boards creaking in protest. As I slammed the door shut, I caught one last whiff of smoke, sharp and bitter, filling my lungs until my eyes watered. I didn't look back. I drove down the mountain roads with my heart pounding, the cabin shrinking into the trees behind me. Even now, years later, I can still hear it sometimes when I close my eyes at night. 3 sharp knocks, patient and steady, waiting for me to answer. And sometimes, if I dream too deeply, I see him standing there, the miner, face blackened with soot, eyes hollow, pickaxe in hand. In my dreams, he's still asking to be let in. I don't know if I'll ever go back to Harlan County. But if you do, and if someone offers you a cheap cabin up in the hills, remember this. If you hear knocking, don't answer. And if you smell smoke when the fire is cold, run. Because the phantom miner hasn't left, and he's still looking for someone to join him in the dark. I was told not to stop there after sunset. Locals spoke about the old homestead in hushed tones, as if the very mention might summon something. They called it the widow's house, though most people knew it as the place that creaked, a house that groaned and whispered as though still alive. I thought it was just another ghost story, the kind of tale small towns lean on to keep kids away from dangerous ruins. But curiosity has always been both my curse and my profession. My name is Daniel Hayes, a 32-year-old freelance journalist from Charleston, West Virginia, and I've made a career of digging into old folklore and forgotten history. When I drove into Clay County last fall, chasing a story about abandoned Appalachian homesteads, someone at a gas station leaned in close and told me if I wanted the real thing, I should visit the widow's place. He didn't smile. He just muttered, "Don't let her follow you home." The road leading there was little more than a rutted trail swallowed by weeds. My rental car protested every bump until I finally pulled over and walked the last stretch. Evening was bleeding into night, and the trees were bare silhouettes against a sky the color of dying embers. The house emerged slowly through the tangle of brush, a hulking carcass of wood and shadow. The roof sagged, the porch collapsed in places, and yet it stood tall, defiant, like it had been waiting. As I approached, I caught the first groan long and low, like a breath pulled from rotting lungs. The air smelled of mildew and iron, sharp and unpleasant, and the temperature dropped as if I'd stepped into a cellar. I told myself old wood always creaks, but the sound seemed purposeful, deliberate, as though announcing my arrival. I crossed the porch carefully, each step producing its own protest from the boards. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom inside, revealing peeling wallpaper and a staircase sagging under decades of neglect. Dust floated in thick golden shafts where the last of the sunlight filtered through broken shutters. I raised my recorder and spoke quietly. October 12th, 6:42 p.m., entering the creaking widow's house. Locals claim it's haunted. My voice seemed to cling to the air longer than it should have, echoing faintly as though the walls themselves were listening. The legend, as I pieced it together from whispers and folklore, told of a woman named Martha Willoughby. She married a coal miner twice her age during the lean years of the Depression. He died in a cave-in, leaving her alone in this house with nothing but his memory. Some said she lost her mind, wandering the halls at night, whispering his name. Others claimed she hung herself from the upstairs banister. No one could prove it. Records were scarce and neighbors long dead, but everyone agreed the house never let go of her. They said her footsteps still echoed upstairs, pacing back and forth as if she were forever searching. The staircase groaned beneath me as I ascended, each board bowing and creaking as though under a heavier weight than my own. The air grew colder with every step, and a sour, sweet scent of rot and lavender perfume mixed together until I gagged. At the landing, family photographs lay scattered, their frames cracked, glass clouded with dust. I picked one up carefully. A woman in black stared out, her eyes dark pits even through the fading photograph. I felt my chest tighten. Was this the widow herself? It seemed almost too coincidental that her gaze aligned perfectly with mine, as though she'd been waiting for someone to look her in the eye again. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the floorboards yawning open in places, plaster sloughed off the walls in strips. My flashlight trembled as I swept it across each doorway, revealing rooms gutted by time. And came the sound. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps ahead of me. Step, step, step. I froze, every hair on my body prickling upright. My own breathing sounded thunderous in my ears. "Hello?" I whispered. My voice cracked and died quickly, swallowed by silence. Then, faintly, another board moaned in reply, this one closer. I forced myself forward, heart hammering. The final door at the end of the hallway waited, half shut. I reached out, hand trembling, and pushed it open. A rush of cold air enveloped me, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of old candle wax and wilted flowers. The room beyond was a bedroom, stripped bare except for a rocking chair facing the window. Though the air was utterly still, the chair swayed gently, its creak slicing through the silence like a whisper. My throat went dry. I edged closer, flashlight beam shaking over the rusted bed frame and sunken mattress. On the knitstand sat a melted candle and a book of prayers swollen with moisture. The rocking slowed, groaning louder before halting completely, as if someone had just stood up from it. My skin tightened, crawling with gooseflesh. Into my recorder, my voice shook. Room appears disturbed. Possible airflow moving furniture. The excuse was weak, and I knew it. That was when I heard it. A whisper, so soft, I thought it might have been the wind. But it wasn't the wind. Daniel. My name, spoken in a woman's voice. I spun, my flashlight beam darting wildly across the room, across the hallway beyond, but nothing moved. Still, the air shifted, heavy and suffocating, pressing against me like invisible hands. I could feel her behind me, close enough that the tiny hairs on my neck lifted. I bolted. My footsteps pounded the hallway, each board groaning as though mirroring mine with its own heavier, slower counterpart. Step, step, step. She was following. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly losing my footing, heart slamming so hard, tasted blood in my mouth. The front door loomed ahead, swollen in its frame, but I shoved until it gave way. I spilled into the yard, gulping cool night air like a drowning man. The silence outside should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Behind me, the house loomed dark, its windows glaring like empty eyes. From somewhere deep inside, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of pacing footsteps across the upstairs hallway. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I tried to laugh, tried to rationalize old houses settle, wood moves, imagination fills in the rest. That's all it was. But my laughter rang hollow. Later that night, safe in my hotel room, I played back the recorder. My voice filled the speaker, steady if nervous, cataloging the house. Then came the moment in the bedroom. I heard my own shaky words. Room appears disturbed. And then, clear as day, another voice layered over mine. A woman's voice, whispering softly. Daniel. I shut the recorder off instantly, heart hammering. The silence that followed seemed heavier than the voice itself. I told myself it was interference, some bleed of static, a trick of sound. But the rationalizations felt brittle, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Since that night, I haven't returned to the widow's house. I tell myself I don't believe in ghosts, that the footsteps, the rocking chair, the voice, none of it was real. But sometimes, when the night is still and the house I live in is quiet, I hear it again. That long, aching groan of a floorboard shifting under unseen weight. The slow, deliberate rhythm of pacing steps, moving back and forth, somewhere above me where no one should be. And I can't help but wonder if she left that house at all, or if I was the one who carried her home. I was told never to stop on the Blue Ridge Parkway after dark. Locals in Roanoke said it like a rule of survival, as if the mountains themselves held grudges against those who lingered too long. My name is Daniel Harris. I'm 32 years old, a freelance photographer out of Richmond, and in the summer of 2019, I ignored that advice. I thought the warning was just the kind of folklore older folks tell newcomers, a ghost story to give the mountains some added mystique. But what I experienced that night made me believe there's something alive out there in the shadows, something that cries like a child and waits for you to make the mistake of listening. It started as a work trip. I had been hired to capture landscape shots of the Blue Ridge for a tourism campaign. That meant driving up winding, narrow roads with fog rolling across the ridges like ghostly rivers. During the day, the views were breathtaking, but when the sun dipped below the mountains, the same stretches of road turned menacing. Trees hunched close, their limbs knitting together overhead, blotting out what little light remained. By the time I packed up my camera gear and got back to my car that evening, I realized I had lost track of time. The clock on the dash glowed past 10 p.m., and I had nearly 2 hours of mountain road before I'd reach my motel. The first 20 minutes were uneventful, except for the uneasy sensation that the forest pressed in around me. The air smelled damp, like rotting leaves mixed with something metallic, and my headlights barely pierced the thickening mist. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a thin, wavering cry carried through the trees. It was faint, but sharp enough to snap my attention away from the road. At first, I thought it must have been an animal, but the longer I listened, the more undeniable it became. It was a child's cry, fragile and broken, rising and falling in desperate sobs. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, or maybe some bird with a cry that mimicked a human voice. But then I remembered what an old park ranger had told me earlier that day. He'd mentioned the crying child, his voice low and careful, as if speaking the words too loudly might summon it. He said drivers reported hearing a little boy or girl weeping on the roadside, usually near mile markers where accidents had happened. Some swore they'd pulled over to help, only to find themselves face to face with something that wasn't a child at all. The crying grew louder, closer, as though whatever made the sound had stepped out from the trees and onto the shoulder of the road. My heart hammered against my ribs. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep driving, I slowed down. The headlights swept over the mist until finally I saw it just ahead. Standing by the guardrail was the silhouette of a child no taller than my waist. Its head was bowed, shoulders shaking as if overcome by sobs. I rolled down my window only an inch. The night air was shockingly cold against my face, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of a little boy crying. "Hey there," I called, my voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even move. I should have driven off right then. Instead, I pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. Up close, the sight made my blood run cold. The boy looked like he had stepped out of another century. His clothes were old-fashioned frayed suspenders, a dirt-streaked shirt, and bare feet crusted with mud. His face, when he finally lifted it, was pale and streaked with tears that reflected in the beam of my headlights. But it wasn't his face that terrified me most. It was his eyes. They were impossibly dark, so black they seemed to swallow the light. "Please," his voice cracked like a dry branch. "Help me find my mother." My throat tightened. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was wrong, that no lost child should be out here in the freezing fog, dressed like it was still the 1800s. But another part of me, the part raised on stories of ghosts and restless spirits, recognized the danger. I forced myself to step back, to keep distance between us. "Where is she?" I asked carefully. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the tree line and pointed into the darkness. From deep in the forest came a sound that made my stomach lurch. It was a woman's voice, low and broken, crying out in pain or rage. It echoed strangely, bending through the mist as if it came from every direction at once. The boy's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, and my entire body recoiled. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root, and scrambled into my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, the crying still clawing at my ears from both the child and that unseen woman. When the engine roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of him. The boy no longer stood alone. Something tall and gaunt hovered just behind him, a shadow shaped like a woman but twisted, its limbs too long, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. Her mouth hung open in a silent wail that stretched wider and wider until the fog swallowed them both. I drove like a madman, my knuckles white on the wheel. Every bend in the road felt like it would be my last. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might lunge into the path of my car. But eventually, the fog thinned, the forest pulled back, and I didn't hear the crying anymore. I didn't stop until I reached the glowing neon vacancy sign of my motel and collapsed into the safety of the lobby lights. The next morning, I asked the desk clerk if she had ever heard of the crying child of Blue Ridge. She gave me a look that was half fear, half resignation, and nodded slowly. She told me the legend went back over 100 years to a settler family that vanished in the mountains. The mother and child supposedly died of exposure after becoming lost, and hikers claimed to hear them crying ever since. But there were darker versions of the story, two whispers of a witch who lured travelers off the road by mimicking a child's sobs, leading them into the forest where they were never seen again. When I told her what I had seen, she didn't seem surprised. She only said, You were lucky you stayed on the road. Folks who follow the boy into the woods, they don't come back. Even now, years later, I can still hear it when the nights are too quiet to thin. Wavering sob of a child, echoing from somewhere just out of sight. And whenever I drive through Virginia, I never take the Blue Ridge Parkway after dark. Because out there in the mist, a boy is still crying, waiting for someone foolish enough to stop. And I know if I had taken even one more step into those trees, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story.